it was really disappointing for me to see that was also here. And I noticed it more in the prairies, because whenever I go to other provinces, it's not as visual or as out loud. I'm not sure if the experience is the same, but here it was definitely a bit of a shock when I first moved here, just seeing how openly racist people were. And I was just like, well, I thought Canadians were nice, but apparently not.
No.
Welcome to The Scaries, brought to you by Race Her Co. I'm Sky.
And I'm Talitha. We are proudly broadcasting, as always, from Treaty 4 territory. And in each episode, we tackle the alarming, inconceivable, questionable, shocking, and scary statistics relating to, impacting, and intervening with the lives of women and girls worldwide.
You'll hear the scary truth, take away tools and tips, and learn about what you can do about it. And really, The Scaries is a opportunity to raise awareness, share resources, and use our voices as women and supporters of women to make some real change. We'd also like to note that the views expressed in this podcast are solely our own. It's for entertainment purposes only. And we will be sharing some statistics that could be triggering to you, so please listen with caution.
As straight, cisgender, white, able-bodied settler women, we are aware of the privilege that we have, and we want to use this platform to spread awareness about the scary reality that women from around the world face in different life situations.
And why?
Because nothing is scarier than being a woman.
All right. Welcome, Scaries fam.
Hi.
If you've been tuning in regularly, you might have picked up on some reoccurring themes across our episodes, really being the significant impact that the intersectional traits of one's identity have on women and the lived experiences and how that impacts how they go through life.
Yeah.
And these aspects could include race, culture, sexual orientation, gender expression, geographical location, abilities, among many others. And they're really the facets that contribute to heightened levels of inequality and present additional challenges, many more additional challenges for women who have those aspects in their lives. So for today's episode, we will be digging into one area of this a bit more. And we'll be sharing some statistics and hearing some personal lived experiences and stories from a guest, specifically about the disproportionate challenges that immigrant and migrant women face compared to Canadian-born people.
So living in Canada, we count ourselves very lucky that Canada is a diverse and multicultural country that fundamentally values and celebrates diversity. And women from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds can find support and community in Canada's diverse cultural landscapes, and many organizations and initiatives exist to promote equity and inclusion. Of course, there's still a lot to achieve, and today we are going to discuss some of the current statistics, facts, and trends related to immigrant women in Canada in 2024. Across the board, our research tells us that immigrant women, regardless of where they come from, often face unique challenges as they navigate new cultures, languages, and societal norms. These challenges are compounded by various factors, including discrimination, poverty, violence, economic disparities, difficulty entering the workforce, and limited resource access. So let's take a closer look at some of the sobering statistics that shed light on the realities immigrant women encounter. Take it away, Sky.
Will do. Okay, so first, as always, we're going to go through some different definitions so we're on the same page. So what is the difference between a migrant and an immigrant? The word migrant refers to someone who moves to other places in search of work or better living conditions, often for a shorter period of time. So they're not always here to stay. The word immigrant refers to those who have moved to foreign countries permanently for work or for better living conditions. In Canada, a migrant is often narrowly applied to foreign workers without permanent residency status. So that's the big difference. One's permanent, one's not necessarily, whether or not they want it because they don't have status or, they haven't attained that yet.
I 1000% use those like interchangeably.
Me
before.
too.
I was
so
like,
this is news for all of us.
Yeah.
So technically all non-Indigenous Canadians are immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Yet the terms migrant and immigrant are often equated with racialized minorities and oftentimes used to promote fear and distrust of others who are different. Immigration policies also defines desirable versus undesirable immigrants. Historically, white, Protestant, British applicants were preferred.
Classic.
Thankfully, these policies that were obviously discriminatory were abandoned when Canada adopted a points-based system in the 1960s. So if we look back 100 years ago, about 38.7% of immigrants were women and girls, and this rose to 52.3% by 2011. And the numbers of women and girls migrating from European countries has decreased over the last few decades. However, the number of women and girls from Asia, the Middle East, and Africa has increased.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
There are two other concepts that we need to define to set the stage for immigrating into the United States or Canada specifically. So it's melting pot versus multiculturalism. Immigrant women arriving in Canada or the United States often grapple with a profound conflict. It's the pressure to choose between assimilating into a dominant culture or preserving their own heritage. And this dilemma arises from the complex interplay of societal expectations, family dynamics, and personal identity. The concepts of the melting pot, quote unquote, in the United States and multiculturalism in Canada reflect different approaches to managing diversity and fostering national identity. The United States has historically been described as a melting pot where immigrants from diverse backgrounds are expected to assimilate into a singular American identity. This metaphor suggests that immigrants' cultural experiences and differences are expected to blend together, often resulting in a homogenized national culture. In the melting pot model, there's an emphasis on adopting a common language, English, cultural practices, and values as a means of integration. While diversity is acknowledged, the emphasis is on unity through assimilation. On the other hand, Canada has adopted a policy of multiculturalism, which recognizes and celebrates the cultural diversity within the country. Unlike the melting pot model, multiculturalism promotes the coexistence of different cultural groups while allowing individuals to maintain their distinct identities, languages, and traditions. In Canada, multiculturalism is enshrined in the Canadian Multiculturalism Act of 1988, which affirms the importance of preserving and enhancing cultural diversity as a fundamental characteristic of Canadian identity. Rather than assimilation, the emphasis in Canada is on inclusion, acceptance, and accommodation of various cultural backgrounds. However, that doesn't mean it goes without its challenges.
And assimilation can provide chances for jobs, education, fitting into society. However, it may mean giving up one's cultural identity, language, traditions, leading to feeling disconnected from one's roots and a sense of not belonging. On the other hand, immigrant women might strongly want to keep their cultural heritage alive for the next generation. Rightfully so. Yep. Their cultural identity is a source of pride and family ties. Yet this can clash with the pressure to fit into the norms of the new society. They might face discrimination and stereotypes if they keep visible signs of their culture, like traditional clothes and language, or, maybe they just go about different things differently, maybe not celebrating certain holidays that we all celebrate. So there's lots of things that can cause stereotypes or biases to come out. And additionally, the fear of being seen as different or facing criticism from their community or for adopting Western values adds another layer of complexity. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Honestly.
Immigrant women often find themselves torn between wanting to belong and staying true to their roots, trying to balance assimilation and preserving their culture as they integrate into society.
So since we're Canadian and share a lot of information from the Canadian context, that's where we will keep a lot of the stats today. So why come to Canada? Why immigrate? Immigrant women are diverse and come to Canada for many reasons. So push factors, quote unquote, such as dangerous situations like war and famine, and pull factors like employment and education opportunities play a role. Some immigrants have family in Canada who can sponsor them. Others have no ties but want to establish new lives, networks, and enterprises. Despite these differences, immigrant women share many struggles and the desire to improve their conditions. Regardless of what brings them, immigrant women enhance Canada socially, politically, and economically, and yet they face a lot of systemic discrimination. Because more women come as dependents of men or as accompanying family members, there are also widespread perceptions that immigrant women trail their spouses, have few qualifications, do not engage in paid work, and are a drain on the system. Great.
So here's another fun fact. As of October 1st, 2023, Canada's population was estimated at 40,528,396. I don't even know how to say this number, but for around 4.5 million, 40.5 million, with give or take 50% of them being women and girls. And close to 1 in 4, so 23% of women in Canada are immigrants. Interesting. And in this episode, we really will be digging into these myths around immigrant women and the stereotypes that are painted on them and the harsh realities that they face because they are just that, immigrant women. It's part of their identity.
Yeah.
And we'll be looking at the realities and some stories from a personal guest as well.
It wouldn't be the Scaries without sharing the stark realities many immigrants face when arriving, but let me be clear when saying this is by no means exhaustive, but rather just a few of the key issues immigrant women face based on our research. So let's start out by discussing the poverty statistics that plague immigrant women. So statistics reveal that immigrant women are more likely to experience poverty compared to their male counterparts. In many cases, this disparity is due to those systemic barriers that limit their access to education, employment opportunities, and social services. So being as that like trail or like dependent on a man. As a result, immigrant women often find themselves trapped in cycles of poverty, struggling to provide for themselves and their families. Data from Statistics Canada reports that female immigrants in particular often have low incomes despite their usually higher level of education than Canadian-born women. In 2000, immigrant women on average earned 64% of the income of male immigrants. They are much less likely to have jobs and are more likely to be looking for jobs than male immigrants with university degrees. This situation is most pronounced for women from Asia and Africa. Only 62.7% from Asia and 38% from Africa were working.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's quite a big discrepancy.
Yeah.
64% compared to males.
Yeah.
Whew. So very concerning. And when we dig into pay equity, Canadian women still contend the income discrepancies compared to their male counterparts, which we've had an episode about a couple back. On average, women in Canada earn about 89 cents for every dollar earned by a man, with new and recent immigrant women facing even greater disparities, earning over 20% less than Canadian-born women. Unfortunately. In response, the Canadian government has actually taken steps to address these inequalities, including the implementation of the Pay Equity Act and various provincial legislations aimed at ensuring equal pay for women. Additionally, initiatives like the Racialized Newcomer Women Pilot Program have been introduced to provide support and resources for racialized immigrant women, though challenges persist in closing the gap fully.
I feel like we'll never be able to fully close that gap.
It's going to take 100 or 200 years, whatever it was.
130 some years, yeah. So the next factor we are going to look at that immigrant women must grapple with is violence. Studies have shown that immigrant women are at a much higher risk of experiencing domestic violence and abuse compared to Canadian-born women. We're not going to dive deep on this because we covered a lot of the important generalized stats of gender-based violence in our very first episode, but it's important to note that immigrant women may be more vulnerable to domestic violence due to economic dependence, as we said, language barriers, and a lack of knowledge about community resources, so not even knowing where to go. Furthermore, newcomers traumatized by war or oppressive governments are much less likely to report physical or sexual violence to authorities for fear of further victimization and deportation. This leaves many immigrant women trapped in abusive relationships with nowhere to turn for assistance.
And finally, the last key barrier for immigrant women that we're going to touch on is the difficulty entering the workplace. So this kind of goes hand in hand with that first stat we talked about around poverty. Mm-hmm. So according to a report by the United Nations, approximately half of all international immigrants or migrants are women. According to a report by the United Nations, approximately half of all international migrants are women, which highlights the significant impact immigrant women have on global migration patterns. However, their contributions are often overlooked and their struggles remain hidden in the shadows. Mm-hmm. Canada is often seen as a forward-thinking country with strong laws protecting human rights and promoting fairness, especially for women. However, there's still significant differences, especially for newcomer women when it comes to jobs in Canada. Immigrant women make up a big part of Canada's workforce. Statistics from 2022 show that out of over 4 million immigrant women in the workforce, almost 3 million were from visible minorities. And immigrants also make up most of the growth in Canada's workforce and population. Even among women in similar jobs, immigrant women often face extra challenges, as we've talked about. For every 4 women in leadership roles, only about 1 is an immigrant. Immigrant women executives tend to earn less as well and have a bigger pay gap compared to others. The COVID-19 pandemic made things even tougher, especially for racialized newcomer women. They were most likely to work in industries hit the hardest by the pandemic, like hotels and restaurants. This led to big drops in wages, with the typical starting wage for immigrant women falling by over 11% between 2019 and 2020.
Immigrant women's unpaid labor remains unrecognized, and when they engage in paid work, it is assumed that they are only suitable for low-skill jobs, often aligned to traditional low-value women's work, quote unquote, like caring for the elderly, caring for children, cleaning, and cooking. Modern immigration policies favor those with money, high skills, official language capacity, and advanced education. Due to gender inequalities worldwide, women coming from countries where the gender equality gap is much higher, they face many challenges to meeting these criteria. So they're not even being set up for success.
No.
Income and education disparities in those countries mean women tend to have less money than men. Thus, valued skills are highly gendered and racialized, and much of the work women were raised to do, so like housework, is not considered a high skill. In addition, and no surprise here, women are often responsible for dependence, which makes acquiring higher education, marketable skills, and work experience very difficult. So these statistics paint a troubling picture of the challenges immigrant women face every day. However, behind each number is a story of resilience, strength, and determination. We're so incredibly honored to have a very special guest with us here today to share her story.
Yay!
Welcome, Victoria.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited.
So we're pleased to share this space today with Victoria Flores, a woman whose life story is as rich and as varied as the many places she's called home. She was born in Bolivia, and her early years were a series of new beginnings, moving from one city to another, which taught her resilience and adaptability from a young age. By the time she was 16, she had already lived in 5 different cities and attended 9 schools. Wowza.
Yeah.
Her move to Canada at 16 marked the beginning of her longest stay in one place. She is inspired by her mother's community work in Bolivia and pursued political science and sociology at the University of Regina. And Victoria's professional life reflects her commitment to fostering a welcoming community. From her initial role at the Regina Food Bank in their employment training program to her work at the Regina Open Door Society, where she began as a job developer, and she's now in the communications manager role. Victoria has dedicated over a decade in the nonprofit sector, much of it working with newcomers to Regina and witnessing the stories and experiences of newcomers and refugees. So alongside her professional commitments, she chairs the Heritage Community Association, volunteers with the Regina Sexual Assault Hotline, and contributes to community projects through various consultations. And in her leisure time, if she's not busy enough, she enjoys biking, cross-country skiing, partner acrobatics, very cool, and gardening. So thank you again, Victoria. That's got to be so cool. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. You have to see Victoria do her partner acrobatics because it's very cool. I've just seen it on social media, and I'm like, my body does not.
Is that a class? Like, is that an online thing?
So I used to do gymnastics, and many years ago, I found out about acro yoga, which in my head, I don't think of it as yoga. So I just think about partner acrobatics. And I found a community of people that do it. There's a smaller community growing in Regina, but it was mostly in Saskatoon and different festivals across Canada. And I'm going to one in Costa Rica in March.
Oh my God, that's so cool.
So cool.
It was like, this is like accessible gymnastics, and it's so much fun because you just get to work with people and do really cool things. And it's like, my body can do this. This is amazing.
Wow.
Yeah, I feel like that's the thing. I'm like, my body will be like, dear Talitha, no, stop this now.
You could do it. You could do it. There's many rules.
Okay, so although I would love to talk to you, Victoria, today about yoga and acrobatics and partner yoga, today we are talking to her about her lived experiences. But first, we are going to start off with some rapid fire questions. We just say these to, get the blood flowing and the brain noodling. So, okay, first one, Victoria, best piece of advice you've ever received?
Was to do it scared or do it anyway. I went through a period of my time where I was anxious about things, and I was thinking like, what if I'm not good enough, or what if I fail, or what if I suck? And then someone said to me once, like, but did you die? And I'm like, no. It's like, well, just do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, okay. So anytime I'm feeling like I don't know about this, it's like, what's the worst that can happen? And just run through my head I have my list of like, is it illegal? Is it unethical? Am I gonna die? Those things. Like, no, but just do it. Like if doesn't go right, at least I have a lesson to learn from. So that's something that's really gotten me out of my, like, you know, when your inner self, you're like, I'm not sure about this. It's been great.
I love that. I love that. Do it scared.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one is a would you rather. So, and we got into a little bit in your bio, and I know we're going to get in more into it, into the questions, but this one is, when you moved here, would you rather have ended up in a bigger city like Toronto or here in Regina?
I've thought about that a lot.
Yeah.
Especially because before moving to Regina, I lived in Virginia, which is a much bigger city.
Right.
And it was so different. But looking back, I think I would have still picked Regina.
Yeah. Yay us. We did it.
Yeah.
And why do you say that?
I think there is a bigger opportunity to find yourself here. Whereas for me, in a bigger city, there's so much to do and stuff, but there's a lot of like predetermined for you, like bigger communities.
Right.
And being here, I had the opportunity to really find things about myself that I don't think I would have in another place. But also it's that idea of like little fish in a bigger pond type of thing. And I do like Regina. I like the size of the city because it's not small. It's not a small town, but it's not too big where I feel like everything is inaccessible or too far. Like when I lived in Virginia, just to go to school was like a long bus ride. And, my mom worked in DC, and it was just like bus, metro, another bus, then work. It's like 45 minutes, an hour later, which is bananas.
Yeah.
And here it's just like 50 minutes everywhere. There's enough to do and enough to like, get you.
Honestly, when people live on the other side of the city, for me, I'm like, ugh.
Oh yeah, the north end, no chance.
It's a commitment. Like, it's like 25 minutes, and then like I have cousins who live elsewhere, and they're like, delete that. I'm like, it's hard.
I know. When I was in high school, I was dating someone that lived like way, way north, and I used to drive there all the time. Now that I like work downtown, live close, and I'm like, how did I do this?
Yeah, honestly.
That was commitment.
You obviously loved that person a lot of the time. Yeah, that was love. Okay, last one, and my favorite one of all the rapid fire questions. What is your scary?
I think apathy. I think when people see things that are going wrong in the world and it's like, not my problem, I can't do anything about it. And when you have a world full of that, then you have a world full of people who are not making community better. And I've had a lot of conversations lately with so many things happening in the world of people saying, well, just like, what can I do about them? Like, there's so much you can do. There's so much all of us can do. But if everyone is just like, not my problem, I'm scared to live in a world like that. I like when people are passionate about things, when people care and like put action to the things they care about.
Yes, very much.
Hit the nail on the head.
Yeah. Honestly, that is absolutely terrifying. Just when people are like, I mean, that's also so much what the scaries is about, is like, there are these really scary things that are happening, but like, here's some tangible things that you can do about it. We can't change the world with a podcast. I mean, maybe we can, but
we're working on it.
We're doing the best that we can. But like just some small steps and trying to care. Okay, wow. Well, that was deep, but
that was good. That was a good one.
Here's the meat. Yeah, that's how we start.
So that was just ripping off the Band-Aid to get her all ready for these really deep questions. So let's kick things off. So number one question for you, Victoria, can you share and reflect on your own identity as an immigrant woman, considering your move at such a young age, and how has those experiences in different locations, how has that shaped you in your sense of self?
For sure. So as you mentioned earlier, I've moved a lot. I think by the time I was 16, I lived in 3 different countries, and it was different languages, different cultures, different friends. And it has been really... So now when I work at Open Door, right? So I meet a lot of newcomers, and when I'm working there, I don't think myself in the same stage in life because I've been here for so long. And even when I travel and they're like, where are you from? I'm like, I'm Canadian. I'm like, am I? Like, where am I from? Like, where, and this idea of like, is where you're born, you're part of your identity. I left Bolivia when I was 14, and I think if I went back there now, I would feel so foreign because my adult life has been entirely here, and all of those experiences that shape who you are as an adult were not there. And the country has changed so much, and the culture is so different. And then even living in the States, when I moved from there to here, it was like when I first moved there, I didn't speak English. That was a whole thing in its own.
Yep.
And the culture there was really interesting because it was a lot like a stereotypical American movie. And then I moved to Canada, and it was very, very different. And a little while ago, I started watching Degrassi again. And
so good.
The first time I watched Degrassi, I was in the States, and I saw no difference between Degrassi High School and this high school I was going to, but mostly because I was still learning English. Like, it was all new. So it all mixed together. And then rewatching Degrassi, I was like, oh my God, this is so Canadian. Like, this is Canadian, right? It's like very different from when I was in the States.
Yeah.
So it has been like a adventure after adventure, even within Bolivia, moving from one city to another, and then a new school. And, you know, like the type of school it meant everybody was different. So it was always just like, hey, I'm the new person. And sometimes it's scary because it's like, how do I make friends?
For sure.
How do you navigate the cultures and microcultures of places? But also it's like, oh, I'm the new person, nobody knows me, so I can be whoever I want.
That's true. So, you have a blank canvas.
Fun fact, everyone in Bolivia knows me as Sarah because that's my first name.
Oh my God.
Okay, so when I first moved to the States, I was going to school, right? And first day, and they're taking attendance, and they usually write the name like last name, first name, kind of like that. So it's a different order. And I have like 2 first name, middle name, and 2 last names. So I think the teacher just panicked because he saw all these names on this thing, and he's like trying to find. And Sarah is common, I don't know, but like Victoria was the last one there. So he's like, Victoria. I'm like,
I guess that's me.
I was like, I can be Victoria. I'm going to be Victoria from now.
Oh my God.
So
I love that.
Yeah. So in Bolivia, like nobody would know me as Victoria. But here, anytime someone hears Sarah, they're like, who's Sarah? I'm like, that's me. Like, no, you're not. And I'm like, yes, I am.
You're so not a Sarah in my eyes. That's cool, so funny. I love that. Just like a side question, because I've heard this from a few different immigrant women specifically, and it's when they are a visual minority, and they come to Canada at like a teenage or even just as an adult, and then they go back to their home country, and they're like, I don't fit in because I'm othered here, I'm othered there. Like, have you experienced that, and what is that like?
I haven't gone back to Bolivia since I left. But I have that fear. Yeah. And even like anytime I went to the States, because there's a much larger Hispanic community, it feels very different. When I moved here, there wasn't anybody that spoke Spanish. So I only spoke Spanglish with my dad. And it was great for learning English. I mean, I learned English a lot faster than I would have in the States. But at the same time, my Spanish got stuck at like a grade level. So if you ask me to write something, you know, like an academic piece in Spanish, I'd be like, I can't.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But so even thinking about going back makes me nervous because it you know, it's like, I didn't grow up there after 14.
Right.
Like, and everything is so different. Like your life as a child and teenager and your life as like a older teenager and an adult are very different. And so I have that fear, even, you know, like how would I navigate an adult life there? Or just like, even when I talk to people, I feel like, do I sound right?
Right. Yeah. And like the fact that, you know, like you're born, your birth certificate is there or wherever. But then you feel like you don't fit in because so you're like, you should be viewed as like, you've experienced so much and like you have this wonderful mosaic of like experiences, cultural experiences, but instead from what I've heard, and obviously never experienced it myself, but that it's like very othered. you had mentioned how contemplating how your life might be different if you had moved to a larger city in Canada or had a different initial circle of friends upon arrival. Can you elaborate on those thoughts and how they relate to your sense of belonging?
Sure. So when I first moved here, my dad, because I moved with my dad, and he took me to Indian Head. And I moved from Virginia, and my school had like 4,000 kids.
Oh my God.
And it was huge. Like, it wasn't even a city. It was like a county and a bunch of other counties, and just like, it was just huge suburbs. So yeah, when I first moved here, it was a tiny town. And I was like, what am I doing here? Like, what is happening? And,
Yeah.
you know, he had a bed and breakfast there, and I was like, absolutely, there's no way I'm going to live. Absolutely not. Like, you cannot do this to me. And so I was like, okay, we'll move to Regina. So I moved here, and it was better. But again, it was very, very different. And it was all new over new, right? Like, I just lived in the States for a year and a half. So I had that experience. And then suddenly I'm here in Canada, and it's like, okay, this is new too. And it's kind of similar, but still it's different. And like, people are different. The city itself is different because it's not a bunch of collection of suburbs. And so it was an interesting way to get acclimated to a newer city. But it was great. I really liked it. I grew up here, graduated high school here, went to university here. But I have friends that I still am in contact with in the States, and they've moved different places, and some have moved to Canada, to larger cities, and their lives are completely different, right? Not in a good or bad way, just different. And I often wonder, like, what if I would have been to Montreal or Toronto, or, you know, where there are larger communities of people from different Latin American countries? Like, would have done something different with my life? Would I be more involved with those communities? Would I have probably gone back to Bolivia sooner? Like, what would life be like? Because I feel like your community has such a huge impact in who you are as a person and what you end up doing, good or bad. So, you know, here I felt like I could just build whatever my interpretation of, you know, what a life is.
Right.
And it didn't have a lot of influences from, you know, a lot of people from Bolivian community or Latin American community. But I often wonder, like, what if I was in Toronto, which is a much larger place, and like, would that be different? And not good or bad, but just different. And how would that impact who I am today?
Yeah, I think that, and I mean, we've talked about the like melting pot versus multiculturalism. And while I think that Regina does the best that we can to be very multicultural, it can be very melting pot-y in that there's not large communities of different immigrants, if that makes sense. Like, there are large communities, but
from certain places, definitely you see it, and you see it, right?
Yeah.
But like, to my knowledge, there are about 7 Bolivian people in this city.
Wow.
Yeah.
Know that every single one of them.
Yeah.
And they all find each other eventually.
Yeah.
Right. There might be more, but like, I've only,
for sure,
you know, and I've always asked, and usually you will find like Facebook groups for certain communities and that kind of thing, but nothing here. And again, when I first moved here, I didn't even meet anybody who spoke Spanish for a long time, which was really weird.
Yeah.
So, and the first time I saw like, I think I heard somebody in a store, and I'm like, hello?
You talking to me? Yeah. Hola. I love it. Yeah, that would be so like shell shocking to go from, even I've never been to Virginia, but I imagine it's definitely, there's a larger community there.
Much larger. For sure.
Okay, so reflecting on your experiences in the States versus Canada, like we just chatted about, you mentioned the difference in the availability of first-generation immigrant Latina or Latino community. So how did this disparity affect your adaptation to or cultural adjustment in Canada because of that missing, I guess, community here, or not as prevalent?
I think it often made it feel like some things feel foreign. It feels like there's an expectation that I should know these things, or people assume that I'm familiar with things related to, and again, it's really tough because living in Bolivia, which is in South America, and then meeting a lot of people, like people from Central America in the States, you realize how much different there is. And you know, like, there's different languages and cultures, and, you know, it's all different countries. But once you are there, everyone just bulks you into the same category. Right. You're just Latino. Yeah, it's just like, all of you are the same. So
Yeah.
no, we're not. We're really not the same.
Yeah.
But so living in the States, I really saw and got to know a lot of different cultures and the way people lived, and just realized how different they were from me, even though we shared the same language and similar histories of colonization and that type of thing. It was still so different to each other, but then to anyone who's not, like Americans or Canadians, we're all just the same.
Right.
And then being here, not having anybody from that community, I felt like sometimes I was like the representation of what like a Latino is, or like a person from Spanish speaking countries, and I'm like, I'm really not.
Yeah.
And sometimes it was tough because suddenly there's this expectation that I have to represent well,
because you are the sole,
right?
You're the spokesperson,
right? And some things that I would do is like, well, this is how I did it, and it might be even just my family, the way my family does something. It's not even like a Bolivian thing, but suddenly someone might interpret that as like, oh, all Spanish speaking people are like this or do this, and it's like, no.
The stereotypes and the bias and the all of that just like perpetuates on too, especially if you like get tokenized in that way. They're like, hey, you're Spanish. Yeah. And like, especially then that you're Spanish. So like you must, and you're like, sir, I'm not actually, I'm Latino. Yeah. Okay. So you had talked about just briefly in your last answer about colonialism and like histories of colonialism. So we recently just had a guest on who talked about violence against Indigenous women, and obviously colonialism has a huge impact on that. So I'm just curious as to like what your perspectives are on colonialism. Have you had conversations with Indigenous people from Canada about colonialism, and what was that like, and what the similarities are and that sort of thing?
For sure. So my family, especially my mom's side, we are a mix of Quechua people and all the colonial people, like, the colonizing countries that came to. So like as most Latin American people are, you're a mix of everything, but there's a very distinct part of my family that I know about that is Indigenous, right? So growing up in Bolivia, there is, I saw a lot of racism and stereotyping against Indigenous people, and often experienced it in a really weird way, because in school, people were really racist towards Indigenous people. And they were like, oh, but not you. I'm like, I literally look like that person. Like, why not me?
Yeah.
Right? But it's because they knew me, right? And they humanized me, but they didn't humanize other people. So I was very familiar with how marginalized communities, the treatment that they receive just because of how they were born, and how that impacts their lives. And my mom also, she worked in rural communities in Bolivia with different Indigenous communities with a number of projects. So I got to see firsthand the work that she did, those communities, and my grandma spoke Quechua. So at a small part of my life, I had a lot of firsthand experience within that part of my culture. And when I moved here, I remember being told about, with slurs, but I don't want to repeat, like these people, right? And I'm like, excuse me, what do you mean? Right? And it would be flashbacks to being back in Bolivia, where people being racist towards Indigenous people there. And I'm like, oh, so you guys got colonized too. So I was like, okay, this is similar, right? And when I was younger, I didn't think about it the same way I do now, that I have a lot more knowledge and education on the issue. But I just knew it was wrong, right? And I would be told, oh, you need to watch out for these people. They're this and they're that. And like all the most awful stereotypes. And I'm like, why? Like what? And because I had experienced it just in a different country, in a different language, in a different way, I was like, well, you guys are doing the same. And my first reaction was not to be like, okay, I'll be careful. Being like, there's something wrong with you. And I don't want to be your friend because, and the more I got to learn about history, I realized historical impact that colonialism has in communities, and the way it separates people, and the way that sometimes people don't understand the impact and effect it has in like generational issues. And because they're not able to understand that, they just are so surface level about what they're uncomfortable with. And it was really disappointing for me to see that was also here, and I notice it more in the prairies because whenever I go to other provinces, it's not as visual or as out loud. I'm not sure if the experience is the same, but here it was definitely a bit of a shock when I first moved here, just seeing how openly racist people were. And I was just like, well, I thought Canadians were nice, but apparently not.
No. I mean, it's nice to have how people think about us, but like the history is not nice, and the experiences are not nice. That's for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So you mentioned feeling pressure to conform to certain expectations as a newcomer, including the idea to be the right kind of immigrant. Can you discuss how this notion has influenced your journey and interactions within your community?
Here at the beginning, not so much, but I remember being in the States and there's a lot of rhetoric about immigrants and immigrants are taking your jobs and like all these terrible things. And I always felt this like, I'm not taking your job. I'm like, I don't want your job. I don't want to work.
You're like, first of all, I'm 14, so get over it.
But so, that was already in my mind, right? Like being in North America. And so in a way I felt like, okay, well, I have to prove that I'm like good and I'm valuable, and I think we all add value in some way and we all want to prove our value. And there's nothing wrong with it, but I always felt like, okay, how do I demonstrate that my place here is earned and no one should question my being here and that I'm contributing and I'm like a good contributing member to society, which is a good thing. But the fact that I always thought about that as like, okay, am I doing this right? Or like, am I doing enough? Or, like even with, I don't know, being in school and people, like teenagers being teenagers and me being terrified. I'm like, well, no, because then they're just going to think like every other immigrant kid's like me if I do something wrong. And, it's like, I feel like, and I've had the same conversation with a lot of other people who are immigrants as well about like really taking on that burden of making sure that you don't do something wrong that gets like blanketed over everybody. And the more I reflect on that is like, should that really be my job as a teenager to just really ponder on that so much?
Yeah,
and
that's a heavy weight to bear.
Totally.
Yeah. And in a way, it's like, it's a good incentive to like do great things and really achieve a lot. But at the same time, it's like, it was a lot of stress I did not need.
Yeah.
So
that is a lot of pressure for a young person that you definitely don't need to take on. Yeah.
How do you navigate the tension between assimilation and preserving your cultural heritage in your daily life as an immigrant woman here?
Making a lot of food. No, I'm kidding. I think because I moved here so young, I feel like my identity is such a mix, and even just talking to my family and like what is their identity and how similar is it to mine, like I'm often not sure if I'm like, have I preserved enough? And again, not having gone back and even being in such smaller communities, like I don't even think I have any friends that are like from any Latin American country that are just like close friends that we can like, oh hey, we do this, or like I know people and it's great to connect with them and talk about different traditions or like joke or that kind of thing, but it's definitely been a hard part being so isolated from people that I would say would have similar cultures or similar traditions. And I think it's just with my parents, right? Just like around the holidays or like certain foods that we eat at certain times of the year or like those kinds of things. But outside of that, it's been really a desert of like cultural sharing. And I don't see it as a bad thing necessarily because it wasn't taken away from me. It's just it wasn't there, and I can choose to do more to be more close to it. But it doesn't feel like I'm missing something necessarily, but it's something that I could have more of, but it's not the end of the world if I'm missing a little bit of it.
Right? That makes sense.
Yep.
For those who don't know, Regina Open Door Society, we will put a link in the show notes so you can go check them out and donate and get involved and all that sort of thing. But in your role there, what are some common challenges you observe among immigrant women regarding integration and acceptance into Canadian society?
I think there's, I often get asked, especially because I'm in the communications role there in interviews, like, tell me about the immigrants. And And it's
so blatant. Just tell me about all of the immigrants.
Right? Because they'll be like, what do newcomers think about this? It's like, well, I mean, certain newcomers think this way and certain think that way, because everybody is different and they have different experiences. And I think what I've learned, that's one of those things that they all come with such different lived experiences impacted by their age, their culture, their religion, their socioeconomic status, and also the reason why they moved to Canada.
Right.
Because someone who came here as a refugee who had no choice, they were just saying, you're going here and you're sent to a country, and someone picks you up at the airport. Their lived experience is so much different than someone that said like, hey, Canada looks cool, I should move there. And they make a conscious decision to immigrate here.
Yeah.
So their experience is also much, much different. And I think the constant, though, that I think would be common among everybody is that they all want to just find home and find a place here and find a community and feel like they belong, whether it's, in their small circle or in the community as a whole. And I think everyone tries to do that in their own way. And what I really enjoy about my role is connecting to other community organizations or to people to make people feel that welcoming spirit, right? And just because I've been there and it was a long time ago, but I've been that new person there. I'm like, okay, like, where do I go? What do I do? Does life work here? And I know how stressful that can be. And I can't even imagine how stressful that would be if you're here with a family and you have to figure that out not only for yourself, but for your entire family. Right. So it's just an added stress. And I think for the most part, people are just, try to have a positive outlook and try to figure things out as they can. And whenever they're able to find, whether it's a friend or a community organization or people within their community to show them the ropes, makes a huge difference in their experience of feeling like they belong in a place.
Yeah. And obviously people are coming with different experiences. And as we've already kind of gone over, there's a lot of different reasons why people come to Canada or the States or wherever they immigrate to.
So working at the Regina Open Door Society, you've likely encountered a diverse range of experiences among migrant women. So how do you see the intersection of their identities influencing their experiences?
I think it often impacts how they're able to settle and feel at home. In sometimes I've met women who have a lot of community support. They have a lot of support at home. They feel confident in either getting a job or an education and making friends. So they have a really, I don't want to say easy, but a much easier time feeling like this is their community and getting settled and establishing a life here. And especially when things are like their lived experience is similar to what it would have been like here, right? Like if the country they came from is similar enough to Canada, the religion, the culture, those kinds of things. But there are, in instances where, there might be issues of domestic violence, or they might not have support at home, or their language level is really low. It can be really isolating for women especially, right? Because usually, even if they have a family, sometimes, the dad's working and the kids are at school, and then mom's like either at home or trying to find a job or, doing whatever she can. But there's a lot of isolation because it's, certain things are expected of her. And especially when there are things like language level or language barriers or cultural or religious barriers to connecting with other communities. I can't speak for them, but I've seen in conversation, talking to anecdotally with some people, like how that can make them feel like they're not part of this community yet, or they want to go home, or like they're not feeling supported. Right. And it's really tough to, especially in cases of domestic violence or in cases where, the religious practices are so different, and it's not necessarily right or wrong, but they're so different from here that, somebody that she might be telling some issues that she's having, they can't relate, and the advice they have, just doesn't really make sense to them. Right?
Yeah.
So because all of those things are part of who they are as a person, and you can't just say like, oh, we'll just get rid of that, you're in Canada now, and just like deal with it, right? And because if they do that, then they would probably just feel like, well, no, I can't just leave parts of my identity to fit in or to feel like I'm at home.
Well, and it's like, I think that's, again, that whole part about the multiculturalism of Canada is that that's who we are. Is like, you can be exactly who you are and also be a part of a community.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Considering the varied cultural communities present in Canada, how do you perceive the impact of having a larger cultural community on the identity formation of immigrant women?
I think having people around you that have similar experiences make a huge difference on whether you can keep traditions and feel connected to people faster. For example, we've had large arrivals of Afghan refugees, right? And within those arrivals, many people, as soon as they come here, they're here for a little bit and then they will move to Toronto or Calgary or like larger cities. And one of the main reasons is because they either have family or friends there, but also because they have larger communities there. And they feel like life will be a lot easier, which I can understand 100% just from firsthand experience. Just being in a place where nobody is like you can be really tough.
Totally. Yeah.
And if you've already come with a lot of, like, especially as a refugee fleeing a war zone and having all this stress and trauma, like that is not necessary to add that to all of that.
Yeah. So
I think having people around you that you can relate to without having to build those relationships, there's just a common ground that we all, whether it's language, culture, or anything like that, it's like, okay, I get you. Like you and I, okay, same, we can relate. It makes a big difference in feeling at home at a place. I do think is a tough situation too, because if somebody only connects with their community, it's like, how do you then connect with the community at large?
Right? Totally.
So for example, when I as I mentioned earlier, when I first moved here, there wasn't anybody that spoke Spanish. There wasn't anybody that, that was remotely, I felt like we could connect. But that meant I was like 100% immersed in the language and culture, and I had to learn English fast if I wanted to know what was happening around me. But when I lived in the States, we had larger ESL classes, and within the ESL classes, there were a lot of people that spoke Spanish. So after you were done class, you could just go back to speaking Spanish.
Right.
So whenever I would go back to visit my friends, a lot of them were still either learning English or still in ESL classes, but it was because they just had to go to school. They went to class, and then at home they spoke in Spanish. With friends, they spoke in Spanish, and there was enough around them that not speaking English wasn't like a hindrance to living their life. Right.
Yeah.
And eventually everyone learned English, but it took a lot longer. So whenever you find community that is similar to you, things are a lot easier. People feel more welcoming, but at the same time, if you only rely on that community, then it's, like now that you're in a place where there's people from all over the place, it can be isolating on both ends.
Yeah.
So it's a really tough place to be in, right? Like it's great to have community around you that you can relate to. But if you only rely on that community, then you miss out on meeting new people.
Yeah.
And because eventually everyone has to live your daily life. You can't be just around your own cultural community, right?
For sure.
So eventually you'll have to meet other people, and which things might be tougher if you only rely on.
Yeah, like that safety net.
Exactly.
Yeah. So looking ahead, what are some hopes or aspirations that you have for yourself and other immigrant women navigating similar journeys?
I really want people to be able to find a space where they feel like they can make their home here without any expectation of like returning or paying for like having been here, right? Like, earlier I mentioned like I always felt like I had to achieve certain things, or I think giving back to your community is always great, and everyone should do that so we can all grow together. But I feel like as people move here, and we're living in a time where there's so much happening in the world, but there's also so much negative rhetoric around immigrants, around people taking things or not assimilating or not doing things right. And I think having so much information available online can make it tough for someone who, might be feeling a certain way and already feeling unwelcome, and seeing the wrong thing might make them feel like, okay, what, how can I do things right? Or so I really want for anyone who's moved anywhere, whether it's Canada, States, or any other country, for them to be able to feel like, okay, I am here and I can make a space here and I can make my own community here and grow to be part of that without feeling like there's a debt that I need to pay to feel like I belong.
Like you need to have like a return on investment kind of thing.
Yeah. Like you owe something.
Yeah.
So last question for you. What advice do you have for folks like us to support and better empower new Canadians?
I think the first thing is just get to know each person individually as a person, right? And I think everyone will share their identity as a new Canadian on their own. I've met people who are so happy to be like, yeah, I'm from this country, this is my culture, this is my language. But I've also met people who are very uncomfortable having to share that part of themselves because in a way they might feel like, why can't you just see me as Canadian? Right. Even last year when we were doing some events around World Refugee Day, and we were lining up some speakers for things like that. Like this was a great learning experience for myself, but referring to people as a refugee, they're like, well, why are you calling me a refugee? I'm in Canada already. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, what would you like to, what is the term I should be using, right? And you can say former refugee or just this person who was or who came here, right? So that part of their journey doesn't have to stick with them forever,
right?
And I think meeting people and letting them kind of lead like who they want to share of themselves to you, and just celebrating those parts, and then you eventually, like, once you're comfortable with anybody, you can learn other things
for sure.
But I think being open to being uncomfortable also, right? Because sometimes you might meet somebody who does things completely different, and in some cases, like, I do think some cultural religious things, like I know you guys had a show about female genital mutilation earlier, which if someone were to share that, I'd absolutely be like, no, that's wrong. Like, I don't care what you say. But there are other cultural practices that are just different, but sometimes can make people uncomfortable, and that's okay, right? Like, being uncomfortable is okay, and it's so celebrating those things, or being open to that curiosity of like getting to know people, getting to know what they bring to communities, and I think all of that makes communities a lot more interesting and
totally
fun, and then you get a lot more, not just diversity, but a lot more innovation, in all kinds of ways, right?
And I think that when you had said it perfectly, is like, it's okay to be uncomfortable. And so often when people get uncomfortable, they like put up a wall and they don't want to know anymore and they get defensive. But if you are uncomfortable, like, lean into that curiosity and ask questions, because oftentimes people are willing to share if you ask from a place of curiosity instead of like a place of trying to tokenize them or like out them or whatever it is.
Absolutely. Then instead of like, why would you do this, more like, oh, tell me more about this.
Yes, exactly. Right? Yeah.
So because it's a very interesting place when you, as I mentioned earlier, when you suddenly become the representative of a thing.
You are,
It's like, tell me about how people do this in this whole entire region of the world. It's like, well, this is how I do things.
Right. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Victoria. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
So we heard from Victoria. She had some really great tips on what we could do to support immigrant women and just all newcomers in general. And so what can we do? What can we take it from here to do? So supporting immigrant women and creating a safer, better, and more inclusive world, as always, involves individual actions, government policy changes, systematic changes. There's a number of things, but we can start somewhere. So from a political standpoint, immigration is a joint responsibility of the federal and provincial governments. The federal government used to take the lead, but this changed in recent decades with provinces taking a more active role in immigrant recruitment, selection, and settlement. Municipalities are also increasingly involved as tasks are handed down from higher to lower levels of government. And over the past several decades, economic immigration pathways have been expanded, while pathways for family members and refugees have been minimized. There have been efforts to balance economic priorities with family and humanitarian responses. Emphasis remains on attracting the best and the brightest immigrants.
Which they talk about that is that brain drain is from outside countries. There's this brain drain where they are recruiting nurses and doctors and lawyers from other countries. And then now there's this drain of people who have all these skills in this country, and now you're leaving them worse off.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there has been a massive increase in temporary foreign workers as well, along with the rising concerns about the nature and the effects of temporary foreign worker programs. There's also been criticism of how Canada deals with its migrant caregivers. This has led to recent reform efforts, but they tend to be too little or too late. So what can and should our government do now? Well, some suggestions that we found were they need to balance family and humanitarian immigration streams with economic streams, regularly and consistently conduct gender-based analysis of immigration policies and programs, and reassess how immigration eligibility for women and men is determined, design more and better public engagement mechanisms that ensure the voices of immigrant women can be heard and acted upon, ensure immigrant women have access to community resources by increasing support to service providers and advocacy groups working with them. They could deliver practical support to immigrant women, such as safe, affordable housing, language training, and accessible and affordable childcare. And finally, they could tackle discrimination against immigrants and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in general.
Yeah.
Some big things to tackle.
Focus on the human and the people versus, yeah. I mean, obviously there's economic gains and the economy and but there's still people at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So taking it a bit closer to home, what can you do? What can you and I do? Well, here are a few to take into consideration, and we challenge you to commit to at least one over the next month if you can. So, as always, you can start by educating yourself, listen to podcasts, listen to audiobooks, consume any type of thing. Take time to learn about the unique challenges faced by immigrants and especially immigrant women, and do better to understand their experiences and how you can support them. Next is to listen and amplify voices by sharing their stories, perspectives, and achievements. As always, be an ally to immigrant women by standing in solidarity with them, advocating for their rights, and speaking out against injustices. Use your privilege and platform to uplift the voices of immigrant women and work towards creating a more just and equitable society for all. Second last is to advocate for policy change and vote for people who promote the rights and well-being of immigrant women, including access to education, healthcare, legal support, and protection from discrimination and violence. And finally, but certainly not least, is combat discrimination and stereotypes against immigrant women and immigrants and anybody in your everyday interactions by standing up against xenophobic attitudes, racist language, and harmful stereotypes that perpetuate prejudice and marginalization.
So that's what we have for you today, folks. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a lot. And it always is, but that's why we do this, because there's not enough people talking about these things.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
We are. So thank you so much for joining us today as we confronted these terrifying but real life statistics impacting women and girls every single day right here at home and where you are too, most likely. So please share this episode, rate it, subscribe wherever you are listening, and stay tuned for more ways to make a positive impact. Together, we can make the world a little less scary for women and girls.
Follow us on Instagram at RaiseHerCo and at scaries.podcast and on TikTok at RaiseHerCo. Remember, change starts with awareness and action, which we are doing here today. Thank you for being a part of the Scaries community and making this world a little less scary to exist as a woman. Bye.